differentiated a little bit, not only more specifically than just taking care of us, is that God is going to supply the needs of His children. We saw that. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33 says what? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and what's going to happen? All of these things. What are these things? In that context, what are these things?
Food and clothing.
Your food, your clothing, those necessities of life. Is God going to supply our needs? Is that the special providence of God for His children, that He's going to supply our needs? Genesis chapter 22. Where were Abraham and Isaac headed in Genesis chapter 22? They're going to the mountain. Why are they going to the mountain? They're offering a sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice is being planned to offer? A son. In Genesis 22 and verse 8, what did Abraham know? His answer to inquisitive Isaac about here's the wood, here's the fire, Dad, where's the sacrifice? What's the answer? While he's looking into the eyes of his son and saying, you are, he doesn't say, you are. He says, God will provide for Himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Did Abraham have the lamb?
No.
Did he see the lamb?
No, not then.
Did God provide? What did Abraham call that place? When Genesis 22, after the whole event, in English, and it's hyphenated in the New King James, Abraham called this place, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. Abraham's going to the place. He says to Isaac, the Lord will provide. He gets there. The Lord provides. And Abraham names the place where the Lord provided. The Lord will provide. So that every time they ever pass that place, where are you going? Well, we got to go past Jehovah Jireh. So that every time anybody ever passed by, the Lord will provide. Did Abraham need the Lord to provide a lamb, a sacrifice? Did God provide the needs for His children? And the general principle I just want us to see here is the faith that Abraham had that God was going to provide. Even when in Abraham's view of things, looking at life through Abraham's eyes, where's it going to come from? How's it going to happen? Folks, that doesn't matter. For me to figure out the intricate details of when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, I'll worry myself to death to figure that out. What I need to have is the faith that says, I know that the Lord will provide. Philippians chapter 4. Paul's very near the end of this book of Philippians. And the church at Philippi, they had a special relationship with Paul. And as you get to the end of this chapter, especially when you start reading about Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15 and read down through verse 19, what's the context of this verse? What does Paul say to the Philippian church that he had just received? What did he just receive from them? Do you know? It wasn't a Christmas present, by the way. Look in Philippians chapter 4. It wasn't a birthday present. Philippians chapter 4. What had he just received from this church? He says in verse 15, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. Giving and receiving what? What's he talking about, giving and receiving? Is he talking about lottery tickets? What were they giving and receiving? Cash, money. Even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. Was that true? I mean, from a worldly standpoint, did he have everything? Was he just overflowing with everything? What had he learned? You go back into it's got to be verse 11, although I'm not, the end of verse 11. I've learned in whatever state I am to be Content. So now he has everything, verse 18. I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus, who was their messenger, the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. When Paul writes this, he had just received a monetary gift from the church at Philippi by the hands of Epaphroditus. And so in context, when you get to verse 19, it says, and my God shall supply all your need according to His riches in glory by Christ Jesus. The church in Philippi had the guarantee that their need was going to be supplied. How did they have that guarantee? What had they done? In the context, what had they done? They had supplied Paul's needs. Paul talks about in that chapter that there were times where he had to learn how to be content even when he didn't have anything. And yet here he receives this gift, and when you compare it to 2 Corinthians, no, it's not my next one. I think it's on the next screen when we get to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. When you read the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 talks about the churches of Macedonia and how they had supported Paul. Well, the city of Philippi is in the region of Macedonia. And so it's likely that included in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 is the church at Philippi. But he had been supplied his need from this church. And so his guarantee, his knowledge is, my God is going to supply your need.
It sort of follows on from what he said earlier in that chapter when he said, be anxious for nothing. You know, he's saying, you've given sacrificially, and I understand it was a sacrifice for you to supply the needs that I have, but you don't have to worry, don't be anxious. God's going to supply your needs as well.
You think if Paul is talking about the same group of people in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, when he talks there in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 3, 4, and 5, about the fact that this was a church that had nothing, it says there that they gave out of their deep poverty. They gave out of their deep poverty. So Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, be anxious for nothing. If you had given out of your deep poverty, would you be anxious? I have nothing, and I just gave liberally, is the word that's used in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I just gave liberally out of my nothingness. Would you be anxious about what was left over? How am I going to eat? How am I going to pay the bills? You know, how's little Johnny going to, I don't know why it's always little Johnny. How's little Johnny going to have it, you know, how's he going to have food for lunch today? Be anxious for nothing. I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. Verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Verse 19, why? Because God is going to supply all of my needs. Do I believe that? Do I believe that? And we'll talk more about this in just a second. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, in this context where Paul has talked a lot about the rich and a lot about riches, he says, command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but trust, that's what we need to do, in the living God who does what? Who gives richly what? All things to enjoy. Everything that I have, where did it come from? Has God given to us? Yes. Has He given us all things? Yes. Has He given us richly all things to enjoy? Do we have an abundance today? I look at everyone in here and I think we have an abundance. My guess is you have more clothes than the ones you're wearing right now. You've been given richly all things. God takes care of us. God supplies our needs. Gives us more than we realize. Malachi chapter 3, and I didn't put the other, go to Malachi chapter 3. I didn't put all the other verses up here. But let's look at the context of this. Do you know where the Bible says, will a man rob God? Have you ever heard that verse quoted before? It's right there in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 8. And here is God addressing Israel and addressing their need to not be so concerned about themselves when He said, Malachi 3 and verse 8, will a man rob God? Of course, the Jews would be thinking, of course not. Why would anybody rob God? And then what does God say? Yet you have robbed me. Would anybody rob God? Well, of course not. Well, guess what? That's what you've done. Yet you have robbed me, but you say, in what way have we robbed you? That's what they would be saying, right? Would anybody rob God? No. You've robbed me. Oh, Lord, in what way have we robbed you? Good question. You're going to say, in what way have we robbed you? The answer? You've robbed me in tithes and offerings. How does that work? You give tithes to God, you give offerings to God, and God turns around and says, you're robbing me. No, God, I just gave you my tithe. I just gave you my offering. You're robbing me. How does that work? I mean, if somebody came to your house and you gave them, $10 and they walked away and you said, hey, you're robbing me. Or they came to your house and gave you $10. I guess that's the parallel. Robber comes to your house, gives you $10, and you say, you're robbing me. How does that work? You've robbed me in tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, verse 9, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. What was the difference? Verse 10. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse. How many of the tithes? All of the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Where did the Levites get their livelihood? Where did the Levites get their food? From the tithes, from the people. My house is not full, God says. Bring all of the tithes, get my storehouse, fill up my storehouse, and notice what he said, what God says, and try me now in this. What does that mean? You want to test me? You want to see what I will do? You have been robbing me. Come now. Don't just bring your little tithe and say, well, I've given all I can. You bring all of the tithes. You fill up my storehouse and try me now in this, says the Lord, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. What's God saying? You can't outgive me, but let's try it. Try it. Bring all of the tithes into my house, fill it up, and see if I won't open. Think about the imagery of this. I mean, God could have just said, see if I don't just dump a lot of stuff on you. See if I don't just give you everything. See if I don't open the windows of heaven. You got a picture? You got a picture of the storehouse that there is in heaven? See if I don't open the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that you don't even have room enough to receive it. Is God ready to do that for us? I mean, is that my Father? Is my Father the same Father the children of Israel had? Now notice the common theme here from Philippians, they were giving, and Paul says, my God's going to supply your need. Even in the Old Testament, you give like you're supposed to, and you're going to have so much in return, you're not even going to know what to do with it. You're not even going to have room enough to receive it. Here's a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. You know 2 Corinthians 9 because we read it often in our worship. Verse 6 is where it says, he who sows sparingly shall also reap. Sparingly, he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. So how should I give? What kind of giver should I be? 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7 talks about the heart that I need to have in giving. To give cheerfully, give willingly. And when I do that, Paul says, God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you always, not just some of the times, always having all sufficiency in all things may have an abundance for every good work. Can you have more superlatives in a verse than that? How much is God going to supply? I mean, God doesn't hold anything back. Paul says in Philippians 4, God is going to supply every need, all your needs. God says in Malachi, I'm going to open the windows of heaven, pour it out on you, and you're not going to be able to receive it all. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, He's going to pour things out. You're going to always have all sufficiency in all things to have an abundance in every good work. Now, do you trust that God's going to do that for you? Here you are as one of His children. Do you trust God? Do you trust His providence? That He's going to take care of His people and supply their needs. What does Jesus tell us to pray in Matthew 6? Is it wrong for us to say to God, "Give us this day our daily bread"? Is that wrong to pray? No, because God promised to do it. God, give us our daily bread. That sounds kind of presumptuous. I mean, that sounds kind of bold. Notice Jesus doesn't even say please. He just says, give us. And He doesn't say, if you'd like to, God, maybe today you could provide us. Give us this day our daily bread. Why? Because that's exactly what God has promised to do. And you keep all of that in context all the way down to chapter 7. And God's promise is, ask and what's going to happen? What's going to happen if you ask? It's going to be given to you. Seek and what's going to happen? You're going to find it. Knock, what's going to happen? Do we really believe this? Do we really, truly, full-heartedly believe that's going to be the case? And so then Jesus says, or what man is there among you? He says, see if this doesn't make sense to you. He lays out the principle, ask, seek, and knock, and it's going to be supplied. And then Jesus draws a parallel and says, okay, do you really believe this is going to be the case with your Father? Think about any man among you. He says, what man is there among you who's got a son? And the son asks for bread. Tell me, what man is there among you whose father's going to give him a stone? What's the answer to that? Where's the father that when his son asks for bread is going to give him a stone? Where's the father when his son asks for a fish, he's going to give him a serpent? Ask, it's going to be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. If you then, being evil, people, being evil, you're going to give your son a fish when he needs it, give him bread when he needs it. You know how to give good gifts to your children. How much more? If we know how to take care of our children and what they have is needs, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who seek Him? Trina?
But there's stipulations, aren't there, on our part? We have to be walking in the light.
Absolutely.
Trying to be righteous.
Absolutely. And so that's the context of this study, is the special providence of God for His children. For His children who are following after what you've said, walking in the light as He is in the light. Seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. That's right in this same context. We've got to have our priorities right. We've got to be trusting in God. You have not because you ask not, but that's in the context of asking in faith. When we approach God and ask Him for things, what do we need to have? A faith and a trust in our hearts that our God's going to supply our needs. And so absolutely, there are stipulations. Was that the word you used, Trina? It was a synonym, if not. Stipulations that we've got to follow in our lives. But these are the promises of God when we are that kind of child. When we're the kind of child who's faithfully following after Him, we've got the special, not just the general providence of God in our lives. There is a special providence that God has for His people. And it's got to be a trust that we exhibit in God, that we know whatever the case is, He's going to supply. Let's see if we can get through this next point, and that's going to be it. In addition, God protects His children. In Psalm 34, it says that the angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear Him, and He delivers them. Does God protect His children? Psalm 34 later on says, the eyes of the Lord, and this is what Peter quotes, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of their troubles. Does the Lord know when we're facing difficulties? Does the Lord know when our enemies have encamped all around us? Does the Lord know when Satan's after us?
David, it's like that song, does Jesus care? Does He care, or does He know when my heart is, yes, He
Yeah.
knows and He cares.
June says, like the song, does Jesus care? Does Jesus care? And all of the verses of that song about my heart being sad. Does He care? He knows and He cares. And He's willing and ready to protect me. Here he says, see, our focus in this passage is often on this first part. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their cry. And that's where our focus needs to be. And then he specifically says, when the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, what does that mean? It means that when those who do evil come against us, God's face is against them. So much so that He wants to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth, because when people come against God's people, that gets God's attention, because His eyes are over His people. His protection is over them. That's why He delivers His people out of their troubles. Have you ever seen God deliver you? You ever seen God's protection in your life? In Psalm 21, look in Psalm 21, because there's a couple verses right around this that I wanted us to look at, and I didn't put them all up there. Psalm 21, let's start in verse 9. This is David crying out to God, and he says, God, your hand will find all your enemies. Think about this. This is David saying to God, your hand will find all your enemies. Your right hand will find those who hate you. You shall make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. Is this graphic? Your hand's going to find them. Your right hand will find those who hate you. You will make them as a fiery oven in the time of your anger. The Lord shall swallow them up in His wrath, and the fire shall devour them. What does that say about your enemies? What's God going to do? Their offspring, verse 10. You shall destroy from the earth, and their descendants from among the sons of men, in the verse that's on the screen. For they, your enemies, they intended evil against you, God. But guess what happened? When the enemies of God devised evil against Him, they devised a plot which they were not able to perform. We'll read the next verse and come back to verse 11. Therefore, you will make them turn their back. Here's the enemies of God. They had a plot, they had a plan, but when you've got a plot against God, guess what? You're out of luck. You might have the greatest of scheme of all time. You're not going to be able to perform it because you can't perform that plot against God. So there David says, therefore, here's what happened, God. You will make them turn their back. They've come up against God with this plan, can't perform it. You're going to make them turn their back and then do what? You will make ready your arrows on your string toward their faces. They came up with this great idea against God, and David says, you know what? God, you're going to turn their back, and they're going to fire on their own faces. Their plan's going to blow up in their face when they try working against you. What does that say about our enemies? When our enemies try to defeat us as the children of God, does God care? Does God know? Does God protect us? If we will trust God, if we will allow ourselves to be protected by God, what is there that somebody else can do to me? Is it my next screen? Good. It is the next screen. Let's jump down here and then we're going to jump back. If God is for us, who can be against us? If there's somebody out there trying to do me wrong, you know what? It doesn't matter. If God's for me, and that comes back to the idea of is God for me or not for me? God's for me when I'm a faithful child of God. When I'm walking in the light as He is in the light, God is for me, and when God's for me, you can't be against me. You might have a plot against me, but it's just like Psalm 21. You won't be able to perform it. It's going to foil. But so what does that mean? I mean, does that mean I could never die? No. But see, we place a lot of emphasis on our physical lives, don't we? What's it say about those who have been martyred for the cause of Christ? Did God not protect them? See, we're so limited in our thinking. And we limit our thoughts to, well, they died. Yeah, they did. Why did they die? They died because they would not denounce their faith in God. Who won? The martyr did. You know, it seems the victor is the one who did the killing. No, what's going to happen to them? God's going to turn their back and they're going to fire on their own faces. And they themselves are going to have to pay for their deeds. But if I live with the attitude that says, Philippians chapter 1 and verse 20, whether in life or in death, my body is going to magnify Christ. Doesn't matter what happens to me. Whether I'm living or whether I'm dying, I'm magnifying Christ. And the next verse says, for me to live is Christ. But if I die, guess what? It's gain for me. If that's our attitude, if God is for me, I don't care what you do to me. But back up and look at what Paul says in verse 18. I consider the sufferings of this present time. Do you think Paul understood the sufferings of this present time? Probably better than we do. But he says, and this word consider is, he's kind of putting things on a balance and weighing them out. And he says, here I've got the sufferings of this present time. But he says, as I balance these out, I consider the sufferings of this present age, they're not even worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. He says they don't even fit on the same scale. I mean, they don't even belong in the same realm. I might suffer now. I might face difficulties and troubles and sorrows and things now. But Paul says, you know, it doesn't even compare with the glory that's coming. Do we believe that? We don't face anything like the sufferings that Paul faced. What do we face? Embarrassment, shame, reproach of some kind, maybe being ostracized from different groups and not accepted by some people and mocked by other people. I don't know that any of us ever suffered any of the things that Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and yet sometimes we get so overwhelmingly discouraged by the things that we suffer that we say, woe is me, I don't know that I can go on. Paul had a different set of glasses than we do, because when he put on his glasses, he was able to see beyond all of this stuff that was happening. He was able to look beyond. He saw the glory that was coming, and he says, you know what? It makes it seem like this is absolutely nothing. It doesn't even compare. Then he says in verse 28, a verse that is a theme verse if you're going to study the providence of God. What's the guarantee of God? That He's going, we know, Paul says, that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Sometimes I think we probably misuse and misapply that passage. Somebody dies, and that's almost the first thing we start quoting. God's going to work this together for good, and the person who's facing that death, they may not even be thinking that or wanting to hear that or even understanding that at the time. Is God going to work all things together for good? Yes. How is He going to do it? Don't know. When is He going to do it? Don't know. That's why we said 30 minutes ago. I don't know the when, and I don't know the how. So for me to say God's going to work it together for good in the next year, it's all going to be better. I don't know when He's going to do it. I don't know how He's going to do it. What does Paul say we do know? that He is going to do it. And that's what I've got to trust God to do. Is God going to give me more than I am able to bear when it comes to temptations? No. He's promised that He wouldn't. Is it possible that I'm going to face more troubles and sorrows in life than somebody else? Does it mean I'm being less of a Christian if I've got more troubles than somebody else? Does it mean I'm not a good enough Christian? If somebody's a better Christian, are they going to face less troubles than me? Look at the life of Paul. Did he have troubles? Boy, he wasn't a very good Christian then, was he? Man, you never think that, do you? Boy, Paul, if you were a little more faithful to God, you wouldn't be facing all of this kind of stuff. You got to step it up a little bit, Paul, and then everything will be hunky-dory. That's not the measure of troubles, is it? That's not the measure of persecutions that come against us. Sometimes the more faithful you are, the more troubles you face. Is that true?
Sometimes people think so. It said, who sinned that this man was born blind, him or his parents?
Yeah.
And naturally people right away thought it was because of sin that he was
Right.
born blind.
You've got the opposite side. Well, if you go off and you do something horrible and you sin, then there's, who sinned that this man's born blind? They thought there were consequences, those kind of consequences on that end. But here's the promise of God. And what do we got? 1 minute? Here's the promise of God. If God's for me, there's not a single person on this earth who can be against me. Here's the promise of God. I can know that He's going to work together everything in my life for good. Now, what's good? How do you define what's good? Who defines what's good? Because see, what's good in my mind may not be good in your mind. Is that true? My good might be a little worse than your good. We're going to have some kind of relative definition of what good. Who determines what's good here? Well, God knows what's good, doesn't He? I think His gooder is better than our gooder, isn't it? God is going to work all of these things out. You tie in with this passage, the passage over in Philippians 2. Verse 12 says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Verse 13 says, what's God doing at the same time? He is working in you, both to will and to do for His good pleasure. Is God working in us to do what's good for Him? We'll pick back up here, finish Romans chapter 8 next time. But I hope as we're looking at this special providence of God that we're building a greater trust in God, that He sees us, He knows what's happening, He cares what's happening, and He's going to be active in our lives, taking care of us, supplying our needs, and protecting us.